All right. So I was teasing Father George just now. I said I go on vacation, and you get like happy psalms. You get like two. Like I've been doing these laments, and you get like two happy psalms in a row, and then I come back and we're back in lament. It's like, which I suppose maybe that's probably appropriate for the dean. So anyway, that's what you get. So Psalm 77 is an IL, or individual lament. And so we have the ascription, the Psalm of Asaph, and I love that the superscript, if your Bible has the superscription, I love it reminds you, this is a psalm. It's of Asaph, a psalm. So just so you know, we're actually doing psalms. So this psalm, of course, is interesting in that it starts out with the problem. It's just like right out the gate. Here's the issue. So sometimes it starts out with some praise, or sometimes, but this psalm just launches right into the provocation, the issue at stake. I cry aloud to God that He may hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God and I moan. I meditate and my spirit faints. You keep my eyelids from closing. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old and remember the years of long ago. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has His steadfast love ceased forever? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up His compassion? And I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. All right, so this is salty stuff because, right, the problem, I say that the psalm starts out with a long description of the problem, that I cry aloud to the Lord is the provocation because God isn't answering. That's what's at stake here. That essentially the first 10 verses of this psalm describe a situation where the problem is, like, I'm praying and you're not answering. Which should be familiar to all of us, right? This is what I like to call a 3 a.m. psalm, right? The 3 a.m. psalm, where you ask, and at verse 7 you have the questions posed to the self, the questions posed by the self to the doubting self. Will the Lord spurn forever, right? Will and never again be favorable, and isn't that, in a sense, the quality of one of the aspects of suffering is that it seems like this is it. That, in a sense, one of the quality of suffering is like it's going to be like this forever. It has that. It really does give you the sense that this will never stop. Will this ever get better? I mean, and as Kit can tell you, I'm a wimp. I feel that way when I have a cold. I'm like, oh, it's like, if I ever gonna have a clear nose or runny nose forever. It's like so. But that's really that's really the quality of suffering, isn't it? Is that it imposes a false narrative on our future. It imposes a narrative on us. Suffering imposes a narrative on us in which it says, I have control of your future. You don't have anything apart from me. I define your days to come. And that's the provocation. And in a sense, whereas other psalms are very specific about the provocation in terms of the temporal circumstances in which you're, like somebody's, I'm being dragged in front of the court for, I'm innocent of the charge is against me, or, somebody is whispering, they're spreading gossip about me in my village, or whatever or I'm sick, or whatever it is. Often the Psalms will have a very specific complaint going, but it's how fascinating that this psalm, in a sense, the problem is the suffering itself. It's kind of suffering qua suffering is the provocation, and then the doubt that arises in the midst of suffering. This is what the psalm really seeks seeks to address. I cry aloud to God, that He may hear me. And this, I think of God and I moan, I meditate, and my spirit faints. And this idea of this is kind of like the anti-praise, right? In a sense, this is there's a crying out, but instead of, in a sense, what the psalmist testifies to in the negative is that the natural condition of humanity, of the human person, is praise. In a sense, we were created to praise God. And when we cry aloud, it should be in praise of God. But because of what's going on in my life, I'm crying aloud in suffering and complaint to God. And so in a sense, to think of God, when we think of God, we should be joyful, right? That would be the normative mode of meditation on scriptures. There'll be a psalm like Psalm 119 that goes on and on and on about, I meditate on your law day and night. It's awesome. And I eat your words. It just sweets my taste and I just can't get enough of it. That's paraphrase. But, this is, I think of God and it grieves me to even think of you, God. That's real. That is in the depths of suffering, to meditate, and instead of being strengthened by the meditation of God and His goodness, a spirit faints. You keep my eyelids from closing, and so I'm troubled, I cannot speak. I consider the days of old and remember the years long ago. Now, of course, part of what those verses suggest, verse 5 especially suggests, is that, in a sense, before we've had Psalms where we have a section called anamnesis. Remember I talking about like remembrance. And so often the idea is like, well then, I was in the middle of my suffering, but then I remember that you're awesome, God, and so it turns there at the remembering. But here you have a remember, and it's like I'm remembering the good old days, and it's having the opposite effect. Instead of being an encouragement, I remember the good old days, or I remember those times when you're with me, and it just causes me to be even more downcast. It's like, oh, well, if why not now? Why? It's like we complain. It's like, man, it's like, did you abandon me? And did you abandon me? Have you left me? And that's what gives rise to the questions that come later. Especially powerful for the Christian tradition of prayer and of communion with God is verse 6. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. And so this is, in a sense, a depiction or description of what I call the biblical anthropology. That is, that what is most inside of us is the spirit. Like the human spirit is the biblical way of speaking of the interiority of the human person. Is the spirit. So that I meditate and I search my spirit. So the spirit stands for the depth of the human person. The human person in the fullness of his or her depth has that person. What we would call like modern psychology, or what the Greeks might call the self. Right? So what we would call a self, in the Bible it calls a spirit. We have a spirit. And so again, that spirit is a personal reality. That is because it's connected to a personal God. That we have the Spirit with a capital S of God, from whom all spirits, plural, come, from whom all spirits come. In a sense, we are all connected to the personal God revealed in Jesus. And that's in a sense, the dignity of the human person is based on the fact that the interiority of the human is something that's called to reflect and actually contains or reveals the infinitude of God Himself. And so, even in the midst of this disconsolation, even in the midst of this deep pain and spiritual doubt, we have the privilege, we have the opportunity, we have the power, if you would call it that, to go into the deepest part of who we are, in a sense to push past the suffering of the present, or to push past how we experience our circumstances that are in the present moment, and push into a deeper part of us, in a sense that there's, I've been on the river lately, so that there's on the surface of the river you can have the wind blowing, and it could look like the river's going one direction, but underneath the current is much more strongly going in another direction, and that's who we are. That is what this psalm is, in a sense, starting to tip the hand that's being tipped here, is that there is a depth to us that is running towards God's grace and towards God's chesed, His mercy, His steadfast love, right? That is proceeding despite the fact that the wind, that other pneuma, that other ruach of the world, that wind might be blowing on the surface in a different direction. And so that's what we experience so often is on the surface. But in our lives of prayer and meditation, we're called to get deeper. Go below, right? Go below the surface to that which is deep. That which is deep. A kind of a threatening version, kind of a non-friendly version of this is a riptide. Like that current that pulls you to the depths that you can't see beneath the waves, but it's there. It's very powerful. And so to meditate and search the Spirit, this is the essence of the Christian's relationship with God. That is, our relationship with God is something that takes place in that communing. This is the way that the NRSV translates this word. I commune. Communion. The communion of God, or with God, in my heart, right? And so here we have heart and we have spirit in those parallel places. So in Hebrew poetry, so you have a parallel here. So I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. So heart and spirit are seem to be parallel expressions. Just like any poetry, you'll use similar words to communicate something. But even these words, words that have slight shadings of difference, which enrich the picture. So the heart in the Bible is, as I've said before, in the Old Testament, the biblical worldview, the heart is the place of human decision making. It's what the Greeks would call a thelos, or the will. It's like to will. Willing comes from the heart in the biblical worldview. The heart isn't the place of romance. That's the Maya. It's like, aren't you? That's that we have to kind of deprogram from our kind of modern symbolism of the body and kind of dig down into the biblical symbolism of the body. So the heart is a place where we decide things. So to commune with the heart in the night, to meditate and search in the Spirit, in a sense, to commune with your heart at nighttime. Of course, now night is not just a neutral. It wasn't like he looked at his watch. Oh, what time is it? And he looked at his watch and he notes the time. Night, of course, is deeply symbolic. Right? It's symbolic of death, of moral failure. When Judas betrays Jesus, it says that he left and it was night. I mean, of course, it had been evening the whole time they were having the Passover meal, but it's that nighttime is noted when Judas leaves the fellowship. He departs the light of the world and he goes out into the nighttime. So when we commune with the place in ourselves where we fundamentally decide for or against God in the nighttime, what he's talking about is, again, an encounter with God that takes place in the depth of human alienation from Him, from God. At the deepest, or the farthest distance from certitude. Right? You want that certitude here, and then night is that place where, and so in a sense, that is the very place where the psalmist says, that's where we have to commit to God. It's easy to commit to God in the broad daylight, at noontime. It's much harder to commit to God at night. Right? In the midst of our moral failures, in the midst of our catastrophes, in the midst of our human suffering. And so to commune with your heart in the night, to meditate and search your spirit, is that in the midst of that calamity, in the midst of our suffering, that is where we're called precisely to decide to trust in God. It's the decision to trust in God. But in the middle of that, so then what the power of the psalm is that then as we're doing that, as we're kind of wrestling with our own decisions, wrestling with our own interiority, with the person, the self that we are, what makes us us, right? When we go to that place, it's in that very place that we start asking these shattering questions. Will the Lord spurn forever? Never again be favorable? Has his chesed ceased forever? Now this would be this is kind of borderline. This would be like kind of, I would say, kind of heresy, right? I mean, isn't that the kind of borderline blasphemy, kind of heretical to say? Because if we've been reading the Psalms, and the Psalms, I mean, one of the kind of articles of faith of Israel is that the chesed of Yahweh lasts forever. The chesed of Yahweh will never go away. I mean, the steadfast love, the mercy love of God is something that's like, everything else may go to, whatever, but we can hang our hat on that. That's something that's an anchor for us. And so what this psalmist is saying is like, well, yes, in the daytime at the temple I could say something like that. But at 3 a.m., I have heretical thoughts. I kind of wonder is that, all those creedal affirmations, which when I'm in my strength, I can affirm, they tend to lose their power for me in the midst of suffering at those 3 a.m. times. Has his steadfastness ceased forever? Are his promises at an end for all time? I mean, to question, again, so just how theologically deep this is really putting the finger on the central articles of Israel's faith. Hesed, love, promise, the land of, to basically say, is his word to Abraham, which basically defines us as a people, is that done with? Has God forgotten? God, he's God. He can't forget anything. But it's like maybe he forgot. Has he in anger shut up his compassion? And the idea of shutting up compassion, it calls to mind, is basically, that's how they would speak about rain, is that when there's a drought, they would say, God has shut up the heavens. That is that. So I've described this before, but I'll describe it again. But basically, the conception of kind of the earth and the creation is you kind of have earth, and then you have the space in between, kind of the air, where the spirits are mostly bad, kind of this like those panamas, those ruachs blowing about. And then over that, you have that, you could get up on a mountain, you see the curvature of the earth, right? So then, they would say that's the bowl. It's like the bowl of heaven. Heaven is an upside down bowl. And over that, they say those waters, because the sky is blue. If you haven't noticed, the sky is blue. It looks a whole lot like water. And so, that must be an upside down bowl, and the water's on the top, right? Waiting to pour down. And remember in the flood, we're basically kind of, and so the idea here is again, you won't find this in like word for word, but basically the idea here is like there's basically a kind of cantilever, kind of like, and so it kind of got, it's like and then he opens the heavens, and the rain, kind of the water falls out onto the earth, and then you shut up the heavens to call it for the rain to cease, and then the earth can dry up, and the waters go back to the ocean where it belongs. And so to here, the idea is, it's like there's lots of water, because, there's lots of water over that bowl. Because you look at it, it's like all blue, right? You look at a sunny day in the Middle East in summer, it's like, all blue, lots of water up there, so that if it came, God let it all down like he did before, it would flood everything. So here's the power of the analogy, that God has lots of compassion. Just like there's lots of water, that if God let all the water out and it flooded the earth, if God let all his compassion out, it would flood the earth. Which is actually that's the line from the Psalms. Let your steadfast love kind of roll like the waters of the Negev. Right? Like the flash flooding of a river in the springtime. And so Say, God, you've got all this compassion. And are you basically just are we in a compassion drought? And you basically shut it up like the waters are shut up in the heavens during the summertime when we think it will never rain again and it's all just brown and nothing can grow on those Judean hillsides. And you're busy trying to get your sheep to like that low point in the valleys where maybe there's a little bit of water or to a well that your ancestors dug, because it's life about survival, right? And so in your anger, have you shut up your compassion? It's like, we need a rain. We need a rain to cleanse the earth, a rain of God's compassionate love. And I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High, again, one of the primary symbols of God's power and sovereignty, the right hand of God. We say that when Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, it's like he is the right hand. It's all, the creed is reaching for those biblical metaphors to talk about who Jesus is in relationship to the Father, right? The right hand of the Most High has changed. This God who is changeless. That's an article of faith. That's called theism, people. And so in a sense, it's like the psalmist is saying, I'm not so sure about this theism stuff because it doesn't seem to be working out. So, in the midst of all that, so I've spent some time describing the setup here, right? And so does the psalmist, by the way. So, what is the spiritual response? What does the Israelite formed in faith do? And in verse 11, what does the psalmist do? Yep. He remembers anamnesis. So it's like, wait a second, let's not give up on this anamnesis thing. Let us, remembrance is a good spiritual strategy. And it's a remembrance of that for which we praise God. And what this is doing is and so really the power of verses 1 through 10 is to really say that what we're going to start doing in verses 11 through 15, what we're going to start doing now, there are existential stakes in this, right? This isn't just, this isn't easy breezy set like, oh yes, okay, there's, bad things happen in the world, but we're supposed to praise. It's a real existential struggle with suffering and its power to foreclose a future for us. Its power to make us doubt our certainties that make life make sense. And so in the face of that, it's like this is swimming against the stream, right? This is like, you know what? I'm just going to start, even though these waters of doubt and pain and suffering seem to be carrying me away, by God, I'm going to start swimming against it. And that's what he does. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on your work, on all your work, and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God, with a small g, right, is so great as our God, with a big G? Right? You are the God who works wonders. You have displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm, remember that right arm that we just doubted a few verses ago? With your strong arm, you redeemed your people. You brought us out of death, out of slavery. That's what you do, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. And again, in the biblical mindset and really kind of pre-modern mindset, to talk the descendants of Jacob and Joseph means like me and my people. He would be included. We tend to think of genealogy as tracing people who lived a long time ago, but for pre-modern people, it's like they're present. Your ancestors are present in you and in your life, right? It's that they're always your ancestors are always present to you, and so basically it's like it's us. You always redeem us. You redeem me from slavery, from death, from suffering itself. So the remembrance is something in which we remember God's works and we go back to praising despite. So that's what I'm talking about. That this is, in a sense, this is the illustration of what it means to kind of go deep. when the wind is blowing the opposite direction, and it was like that we go deep to get in touch with that current, right? That brings us towards God. That's what it looks like, is to remember God's goodness and love in the face of everything kind of testifying against it. And then we have the description, and the psalm closes with the description of a theophany. That is, of a manifestation and a personal appearance of the Lord God. So when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled. Clouds poured out water, the sky, sunrise. So there's that pouring out again. So it's like, hey, God is in the business of pouring out, not shutting up. And we're not talking about water. That's the symbolism of poetry. Remember, this is a poem. You're supposed to hold all that symbolism up above in your head as you read what comes later. The clouds poured out water. The sky thundered. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. So the beautiful thing of this poetic description is that it can be, is both a description of the creation itself, with all that water pouring out and the thunder, basically it's like the kind of the elaboration of Genesis 1 that then took over in the rabbinic traditions, like kind of like the waters of chaos are there, and God says, like, stop. And it's kind of like where the wild things are. It's like when the boy says, stop! And they stop. Because all the waters and the forces of chaos and suffering are rolling their terrible eyes and gnashing their terrible teeth, right? And the boy says, stop. So God is like that. It's like, stop that. And the waters stay where they are. They retreat. And so that the land is made, right? And so land, the place of, fertility and gardening and fruit, right? That's the land versus the water, which only those crazy pagans go on. Only they build ships and they travel on them. That's crazy. Meshuggah, right? So the waters saw you, God. The waters saw you. They trembled. They were very deep. But this can also describe the Red Sea event. Also, it's a both and why? Because what the psalmist is trying to say, what the psalmist is trying to do, is to say, Genesis 1, right, and Exodus, I want to say 14, 15, somewhere the water happens. It's like the night is 13, 14. So anyway, it's right. And so somewhere in between 20 is the Ten Commandments. So anyway, this is what happens, David, it's like you get old and you forget it, the Old Testament. So, but it's somewhere in that vicinity. And so, but that these two fundamental events are one and the same thing, is creation work. And it's the Exodus has new creation. That is what the testimony of the Gospels is rooted in, the testimony of God to his people Israel. It's not, in a sense, being invented out of whole cloth by Paul or by Jesus. It's bringing in the presentation that's already implicit in the Psalms and in the traditional elaborations of the narrative of Israel, that God bringing his people through the waters of the Red Sea was a new creation, in a sense. It was taking a slave people and remaking them into a free people. It was in a sense, they were born anew. That Abraham's descendants are, in a sense, created newly on the other side of the Red Sea. That's already implicit in the narrative theology of the Old Testament, right? And so we see the psalmist here in Psalm 77 say that, basically apply it to, again, in deep anticipation of the cross itself and the resurrection. That in the midst of suffering and of radical doubt, that is when we are called to remember that God is a God of new creation. Right? And that which God made, God can remake. That which God has blessed, God can bless again. Newly and in a more radical way. So in the sky thundering arrows, that's lightning. Your lightnings lit up the world, the earth trembled and shook. So that's Sinai. You have to think of the Sinai event. So you have water plus lightning equals Red Sea Sinai. That's what's going on there. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea. Oh, now we know it's Exodus, right? So that's the giveaway. But it's been building to this moment. Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. How beautiful. Your way was through those waters, but we couldn't see your footprints. Which also kind of, in a sense, works in the creation narrative, in a sense that God was busy creating, but we can't, you can't see where he was walking and doing stuff like you can with a human being. It's like, oh, there's a human being doing stuff here, right? You see little, footprints in the sand. But we can't see God, but we know his works. We know his power. We know his love. Your footprints were unseen. It's like the opposite of that little poem that everybody has, it's like, then the footprints were yours because you were carrying me. Anyway, but it's like the opposite of that. It's like, somehow I got here. I don't know how, but I know you were there. Your footprints were unseen. And what the psalmist invites us to at the end of this meditation on human suffering, on radical doubt, on an existential challenge to the human self, posed by the power of death and the power of mortality itself, the condition of being human. And that's one of the real powerful truths that the Psalms really get at, is that, in a sense, being human is the greatest challenge to being human. That's, it's that paradox in which we live. That our capacity for suffering can either be an enormous power of love and new creation world, and it can also be the very thing that pulls us away from God, right? The very same thing. Our capacity to truly suffer, and to suffer kind of existentially. That the ability to have a narrative autobiography in our heads. That our self is made up of a kind of a narrative autobiography. That the you that you are is made up of your memory of what has brought you to this point. That's yours and yours alone. You can't really share it with anybody. That science fiction movies are dealing with this, right? But what does it mean to have memories? What does it mean to you? And this is what separates us from the animal creation, right? I mean, it's kind of like, I like to say, dogs are just, either they're sad or they're, happy. They don't know why. It's just like, they live in the moment. The dog lives in the now. They're happy to see you. It's like, but they don't have to worry why they're happy to see you. They just are. They're just happy to see you. Welcome home, Dad. And so that's where they live. That's why it's good to be a dog. Because the dog doesn't have to worry about how you're going to go tomorrow. And that's the human, right? The human says, oh, sure, well, I'm happy to see you, but, you're going to leave tomorrow again, and then I'm back at it, back in the doldrums, but so that's the difference with the human, right? So our very capacity for memory and for narrative can undo us. But when we look back at the narrative of our lives, in a sense, can we acknowledge God's presence even though his footprints were unseen at the time? Right? That's the powerful beauty of this poem. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And so you get the shepherd metaphor that was, Psalm 23, of course, everybody's favorite psalm, Psalm 23, and also Ezekiel 34, right? So the image of the shepherd. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron, and you will lead us again. And so what it lands in is in the sense that we are in the midst of our suffering, as we remember God's deeds, we are on that journey. We are on the journey of new creation. And that's what we as followers of Jesus are called to remember in our lives, is that we are walking in love, in that journey of new creation, as we'll hear in Ephesians this morning. All right, Well, that is it, and that's Psalm 77. And so next week we'll be back at Psalm 78. It's a long one, but it's like we'll have to tackle it a little differently. But anyway, so glad you came today, and God bless you all. Have a great week, and we'll see you then.